The Update Panel control is amazingly powerful right out of the box. Just wrap your new or existing controls in an Update Panel and use its child content template, and the Update Panel will automatically do all the heavy JavaScript work to perform partial page updates. But you have a lot of flexibility. The Update Panel has a lot of properties that let you change its default configuration to work exactly the way you need in order to provide for your specific situation. One example is render mode. When the Update Panel renders HTML to the browser, it renders all of the content template controls in a container tag. This default container tag is a div. The drawback of using a div tag as a container is that without special cascading style sheets treatment, a div tag is always going to render as a block element and creates a new line break within your page. In block-like controls such as a data grid or login control, that's usually okay because it's already rendering on a new line. But when you want to render content that might be in line with other content, you can change the render mode from its default mode of block to inline. This causes the rendering container for the Update Panel to render it as a span tag instead of a div tag. So you have some flexibility in the layout of your page. Another attribute is Update Mode. Update Mode is, well, it's irrelevant unless you're using more than one Update Panel on a page. The default behavior of the Update Panel is to update itself anytime the page is refreshed. So imagine that you have a Panel A and a Panel B on a page. When something triggers Panel A to update, Panel B is also going to update. That's because the update mode of an Update Panel defaults to always, which means that the Update Panel content is going to be updated on every full page or partial page update. And again, when the page contains only one Update Panel control, the setting is irrelevant. But if you have multiple Update Panels, the setting lets you define when certain Update Panel content is updated and when it's not. And you use the conditional value, which causes the Update Panel to update itself only when it's specifically called. All Update Panel contents are updated on the same request. So there's no extra server processing time and no extra requests when working with multiple Update Panels. A minute amount of extra bandwidth is used since the content of both the panels is returned with each partial page update. You have to remember that on a partial page update, the server is receiving from the browser the view state as well as the contents of the Update Panel. And that way, the server has the materials it needs in order to provide the client-side JavaScript code with what it needs in order to update a portion of the page. If Update Mode is set to conditional, each child control of the Update Panel's content template will automatically update its Update Panel parent. But imagine that you have 10 Update Panels on the page, and you want one to manually update another. You can force the Update Panel content to be updated and returned by using server-side code to call an update method on the Update Panel. Now you should understand that the Update Panel update method is a server-side method and is not available in JavaScript on the client. So this isn't something that you can write JavaScript code and cause an Update Panel to be updated. The update always occurs on the server and make sure that the appropriate Update Panel returns updated content to the caller, no matter what the update mode value of the Update Panel is. A direct call to update always sends new content back to the client, regardless of the state of the update mode property. That's just something that you need to play with in order to understand and use efficiently. The Children as Triggers property controls whether or not a child control in the content template is automatically wired up to update the content in an Update Panel. It's set to true by default. You normally want to leave this property set to true, but there's a couple scenarios that you might consider changing the value to false. One is that when you're using nested Update Panel controls, you might not want to update the content in a parent Update Panel control when a child update panel control is updated. The other scenario is when you have controls that you don't want to post back via an AJAX request. So if you have a control that you would like to perform a full postback, you can set the child as triggers to false, and then the update panel will not hijack that control's __ do postback method, which is a client-side JavaScript method that ASP.NET uses in order to support full-page postbacks. But what happens if you have both these scenarios simultaneously? You have some child controls in an update panel's content template for which you want to automatically refresh content with partial page updates, and other child controls that you don't want to trigger partial page updates. How do you define which controls perform partial page updates and which controls force full page postbacks? Well, then you can do that with the triggers collection of the update panel control. Let's explore some of these features. In this sample, I'm going to expand this server AJAX.aspx page that I created a little bit earlier in order to present the user with a drop-down list of product categories from the AdventureWorks LT 2008 database. When the user makes a selection, the page is going to display a list of the products in a list view control, list of the products that are in that category. And instead of posting back and receiving the entire page every time the user makes a selection from the list of categories, the application is going to update only the portion of the page that changes in the browser, which is that list of products. So the first thing I'm going to do is add an update panel to this page. So I'll come over here to the AJAX extension section and double-click on the update panel, or I can drag it over to the page, whatever suits me best. And here's one place where the control isn't fully integrated within Visual Studio. I need to add a content template, and I have to do that within Source View. There's no support for doing this within the design view of the web page designer. But the nice thing is that I get this nice IntelliSense, and there we go. We have a place to put our content now. The next thing I'm going to do is add a SQL data source, because that's how I'm going to get the information or get the data from the AdventureWorks database. Come back over to the toolbox, go to the data section, and double-click on the SQL data source. So I'll switch over to the designer, and there's their SQL data source. And now I'm going to configure it. You can do this all in Source View, but it's usually a little bit easier to do all this stuff in Design View using the Controls Smart Tag. Notice that I already have a connection to that database. So I'll select that, and I can look at the connection string and so forth. If that didn't already exist, I could click on the New Connection button and go through the steps to create that connection object. And I'll click on the Next button. Now I need to select data from the product category table, and I'll retrieve the product category ID and the name, because this is the data that's going to be within a drop-down list. And I'll go ahead and order it by name, so it's sorted within the list. And I'll click on Next, and we can test the query, and it fails. The reason why it fails is that Visual Studio 2010 still doesn't support schemas within SQL Server 2008. So that's actually okay. And I'll click on Finish, and now we've configured that SQL data source. But we need to fix that problem. And the way we fix it is by coming over here in Source View, and within the From clause here, adding that Sales LT schema name, because it couldn't find just product category without that schema name. And as long as I'm here, I'll clean this up a little bit, make it a little bit easier to see. And there we go. All right. And so now we've configured the SQL data source in order to grab the data from the underlying database. Now I need to add the drop-down list box. So I'll come back over here to the toolbox, double-click there, and I'll go back over to the design view. And I'll use the Smart Tag to choose the data source. I only have one on the page at the moment. And then I can configure, oops, isn't quite updated yet. So I need to refresh the schema. And I want to display within the drop-down list the name field, but I want the value of it to be the product category ID. All right, so we have the drop-down list configured. I'll go ahead and run the page to make sure that's working. And as you can see, we now have a drop-down list with all of the categories from the AdventureWorks database. So we're good to go. All right, next thing I need to do is add another SQL data source. So I'll come back over to the toolbox and double-click to add that. And I'll once again select to configure the data source in order to get the product list data. So I'll go ahead and use that same connection string that I have there. And this time I need to get data out of the product table. And I'm going to extract the product ID, name, the product number, and the color, as well as the list price. So those are the fields that we're going to display to the user. I also need to define a where clause that's going to filter the product category ID based on a control in the page, in this case that drop-down list. And I'll set the default value to 1. In addition, I'll sort the list by name. And we should be good. I could try to test it again and provide a value, but I get that same error message. It's definitely an annoyance that Visual Studio doesn't support schemas within SQL Server. So I once again have to go into Source View, and here within the Select command, add that schema name. All right, so now it's going to be able to identify that file. The other thing I'll do is I'll make the field names a little bit prettier so that when the data is displayed within the list view, it doesn't appear with a column name of product number, for example, that is all glommed together. So I'll just use an alias here for both product number and the list price. Okay, I'll go back to Design View. And the next thing we need to do is add the List View control. So I'll come over to the toolbox, double-click on it there, and there we have a list view. I'll select the SQL Data Source 2. All right, and then I'll configure the list view. I'll stick with a grid layout, but there's lots of other options. And I'll use the blues style. So there's lots of other options that you can use for a list view. Great. All right, I'll save the page, and I'll go ahead and run it so we can see what the page looks like. So now we have a populated list box. I can select different items here. If there's no data, it'll say no data was returned. And I'll go down to gloves. That's kind of weird. I know there's data. Not all categories have products, but I happen to know that gloves does. Let's see. I bet if I go back to my source code here, and I look at my drop-down list, yep, I didn't set the auto postback property. So let me go ahead and do that. I'll set that to true, because we need, even though we're using an update panel, we need the drop-down list to trigger a postback. It's going to be handled as a partial page postback because the code is within this update panel, but we still need the drop-down list to be doing a postback. All right, I'll do that, save that, and we'll try again. So we get an initial full page. Accessories doesn't have any data. And I'll come down here and try gloves again, and now we get data. All right, so now we have a working application. Now notice that the most complicated part of creating this page was setting up the data access for the drop-down list and the list view controls. In order to use AJAX, you really just need to add an update panel, because the page already contained a script manager control, and then place other controls within it. How much simpler can that possibly be? The page, however, does have one problem. As it stands now, the AJAX call made when the user selects a category includes the drop-down list in the call. That results in too much data being sent with the AJAX request and too much returned with the response. The list of categories isn't going to change, or at least it doesn't change all that often. So there's really no reason to include the drop-down list within the update panel. So we really need to remove it from the update panel. But we need a way to indicate that the selected index change event of that drop-down list should trigger an AJAX request to update the grid. And the way you do that is with the triggers child element of the update panel. The default behavior of the update panel is to capture the do postback event the child controls emit, and then perform an AJAX-like partial page update. This is desirable behavior in most scenarios. But there are ways to manipulate the default behavior and have more control over the postback mechanism of each child control and the use of an async postback trigger and regular postback trigger. A little earlier, I talked about the children as triggers property. This property is set to true by default, and all the child controls that emit a postback will work with AJAX partial page updates. But you may want to change this behavior in a couple scenarios. First is when you have specific control to which you want to assign traditional postback functionality, and you can do that with a postback trigger. Or when a control is outside the content template of the update panel, and you want the postback functionality of that outside control to refresh the update panel. Then you can accomplish this with an async postback trigger. A postback trigger is effective when you have a control in the content template that needs to perform a traditional full-page postback. The control might have to redirect to another page with a response.redirect, or may need to perform a full postback action for some other reason. Let's take a look at expanding our sample page in order to use an async postback trigger in order to allow the drop-down list control to be outside of the update panel. Here's the server AJAX page as we last left it. What we need to do is modify this page to move the drop-down list as well as its SQL data control out of the update panel, and then connect its selected index change event to cause the AJAX request. And we make that definition within the trigger. So it's easiest to make these kinds of changes within SourceView, although it's certainly possible within DesignView as well. So I'm going to select the SQL data source that feeds data to the drop-down list, as well as the drop-down list. I need to make sure that I include the closing element there. And I'll do Control X, and I'm going to stick it right between the script manager and the update panel. And I'll move it over a little bit. Okay, so now those two elements are outside of the update panel. And I'll save the page. Now I need to create the trigger. I can do that in SourceView, but I'm going to do it over in DesignView. Makes it a little bit easier. So I'm going to select the update panel. Convenient way to do that is just click outside of any controls that contain it, in this case to the right of the list view. And then I'll go to the Properties window, and I need to make an entry within the Triggers collection. So I'll click the ellipsis button, and I'll click the Add button in order to add a new async postback. I can also use this arrow here if I actually wanted to create a postback trigger. But in this case, we want an async postback. Now I need to associate it with the control that is going to cause this trigger to fire, and that's that drop-down list. And the specific event that I want to associate with the trigger is the selected index changed. And I'll click OK. Now let's go over to SourceView and see what happened. So as you can see, way down here after the closing tag for the content template, the designer added this triggers element. And then it also added this ASP async postback trigger that links this trigger to the drop-down list and the selected indexed changed event. All right, I'll save the page and run it again. And I'll select a few items, a couple that have no data. Gloves has data. Mountain bikes has data. So as you can see, nothing about the behavior of the page has changed, and the same basic AJAX request and response happens. But if you were to use a tool like Fiddler or Firebug, you could look at the request and responses going back and forth in response to a change to the drop-down list. And you'd see that there's less data being passed back and forth because the drop-down list data in the long list of categories is no longer being posted with the request, nor returned with the response from the server. In general, you should include in the update panel only the controls that are going to change as a result of the AJAX request. If the triggering control isn't going to change, just like the drop-down list control here, place it outside the update panel and include a definition of a trigger to link it with the AJAX update. The script manager and update panel controls are by far and away the most important AJAX server-side controls for implementing partial page postbacks. But the other three AJAX controls, script manager proxy, update progress, and timer, can help handle various scenarios of AJAXified pages, if you will, and make the user experience even better. So let's talk about the script manager proxy control. As its name suggests, this control is related to the script manager that every server-side ASP.NET AJAX page requires. The proxy version is useful when you need to access the script manager control that's located on a master page from a content page. If you do plan to use AJAX throughout your site, it makes sense to place the script manager control on the master page in order to make it available automatically on every page in the site. For most content pages, then, you would add an update panel and other AJAX controls in code without adding a script manager control to every page. That's the beauty of ASP.NET master pages, and it all works with nested master pages as well. But what if you need to change a script manager control setting from a content page? You don't have direct access to the master page's script manager from a content page. That's where the script manager proxy control is handy. You can add one to your content page, add the changed setting, and the content page will then use that custom setting in that page, and then inherits all the other settings from the master page. It's probably not a situation that you'll encounter often, but keep Script Manager Proxy in mind for such occasions. If you add a Script Manager Proxy control to a content page that uses a master page with no Script Manager control, then you'll get an error. In that case, either use a Script Manager control in the content page or add it to the master page. Script Manager Proxy is an easy-to-use declarative way of working with Script Manager controls in master pages, but it exposes only a subset of the full set of Script Manager properties. Those properties are probably the ones that you're likely to need for most applications. But if you need more, you can also access the master page's Script Manager control in code. So you can do all of this in code as well. Another server-side AJAX control is the update progress control. AJAX requests are asynchronous by nature. That means that the browser sends off a request to the server and doesn't wait for a reply. The page remains responsive to the user, giving the web page the feeling of a desktop application. And then when the browser receives the response from the server, it updates some part of the page. But occasionally it can take some time for the server to respond to a request. Good user interface design suggests that the page provide some kind of indication that something is happening, even if it's illusory and doesn't really convey real status of what's happening. ASP.NET provides an update progress control that makes it easy to display this kind of status information. Let's add that to our server AJAX page. The first thing we need to do is introduce a bit of a delay in the page processing. Since I'm running this page on the local machine, we're just getting back too quick a response. So we want to delay things a little bit so that we can see the update progress control in action. The way I'll do this is I'll double-click on that drop-down list control and add some code to the selected index changed event. So I'll use system.threading.thread.sleep. And I'll put it to sleep for 5 seconds. All right, so let's go back to the page and return to source view. I'll go ahead and add that update progress control. So this is within the AJAX extensions section of the toolbox. And I'll drag and drop it right there. Okay, so that puts it outside of the update panel, but right after the drop-down list. There's really no reason to put it within the update panel, since the page doesn't need to update it as a result of the AJAX request. All right, now I need to add a child progress template here. And I'll just enter some text. This is what's going to appear while the user is waiting for the page to be updated. All right, so I saved it. Let's go ahead and run it. Here's the initial page load. And we'll go straight down to gloves this time. A little bit of a delay, waiting for the 5 seconds. It displays that text, and then, after the 5 seconds have elapsed, we get the response from the server. Do it again, go down to mountain bikes. It's getting the data we want. And after the 5 seconds, we get all the mountain bikes. So now the user has something to look at while they're waiting for their results to come back from the server. All right, that's all well and good, and it's nice to display some text and let the user know that something's going on. But modern applications are often flashy, so it'd be nice to display an automated graphic for the user to watch while waiting. So in order to do that, all we need to do is change the contents of the progress template to use an image. Now if we go over to Solution Explorer and look within the Images directory here, we see that we have an AJAX loader, and that's an automated GIF that will fit the bill perfectly. So I'll come back over here, and I'll manually add an ASP image control, given an ID of image 1. It's a server-side control, so we'll set that. And then I need to specify the image URL. And it'll be from the root directory in images/ajax-loader.gif. All right, I'll save and run the page again. And I'll go ahead and make some selections. I'll select bikes. And now we have this nice animated GIF, displays for 5 seconds. And then we get the result. I'll go to gloves. And finally mountain bikes. The nice thing about using an animated GIF like this, or something else that moves, is that it makes it much more evident that the current data the user is looking at is not the current ultimate data. So, for example, if I select gloves again, during the time that I'm waiting, it's going to continue to display mountain bikes. Now, you can change that. So you might want to consider doing something to make the current data go away. but it's a much more usable interface with that update progress control. Now there's one more improvement that we can make. For quick operations, it may not make sense to show the progress graphic. If the call returns within maybe say a second or two, the user really doesn't wait all that long for a response. So you can delay a bit before the progress indicator appears. If the operation takes longer than the delay period, then the graphic appears. And the update progress control supports that. So here within the update progress, I'm going to add a display after attribute. And I'll set it to 2000, which is 2000 milliseconds, 2-second delay. Save the page and run it again. And notice that nothing appears, 1, 2, and then it appears for the remaining 3 seconds. 1, 2, appears, and then we get the data. One common scenario that you can handle with AJAX-enabled pages is to update the contents at some set interval. This can be useful, say, on a portal site where you want to keep the content current. For an example, an update occurs every 5 minutes or at some user-specified interval. It can be highly annoying to have the entire page refresh as a user is reading a portion of it. So you can use AJAX to limit the update to small areas of the page. You can also use this periodic update in combination with regular full page refreshes, if that makes sense for the page. And ASP.NET makes all of this easy with the timer control. I have 2 different pages here that display the time to the user. This first sample page, the servertime.aspx page, is a simple clock application that uses the timer control to display the time and refresh it every half second. So here's the HTML that defines that. I have a script manager on the page. Don't really use it in this particular example, but I'll use it a little later. And there's the timer control. It's a server-side control, and the interval is set to 500 milliseconds, or a half second. Each time a half second passes, it's going to fire off the timer1_tick event procedure. So we'll go ahead and look at that. And as you can see, all it's doing is using the datetime object in order to return a long time string and assign it to the text property of the label1 control. Fairly simple code. And there's that label1 that is going to display the time. And I'll go ahead and run the page. So there it is. It displays the time, refreshes every half second, but it's a highly annoying experience. There's all kinds of things flashing. So let's just close this thing down. All right, so that achieves the desired effect, but we can do a lot better. So here's the Server Time Better page. And what this page does is it places within an update panel control that label that displays the time. The timer is outside of the update panel. There's no reason for it to be contained within the update panel. It's still set to 500 milliseconds, but because the timer control is the trigger for the update and it's outside of the update panel, we have to define a trigger that links that timer1 control with the tick event procedure. So I'll go ahead and run this version of the page. And as you can see, this is a much better experience. There's no flashing. The user gets the updated time, and it's not causing a full page postback every time the tick event fires.